Hello, and if you don't know me, my name is Steve Smith, and my goal here is to give you a succinct overview for a case for faith. I've had so many conversations about faith over so many years with very many people, and you may be one of those people, and it seems to me that we usually get bogged down in discussion about specific issues, whereas I believe being able to give you something of an overview will bring a whole lot more clarity. You'll know the expression, failing to see the forest for the trees. When discussing faith and focusing on just one thing, for example, the Big Bang or maybe fossils, we all too easily miss the wider perspective that would give us a much better understanding. Seeing the big picture changes everything. And so I want to call this presentation Hidden in Plain View. It's not an original phrase, but I think it sums up what I'm trying to point out. Many feel that belief in God is outdated and fanciful, even ridiculous. But I believe when you actually see the big picture, the reality of God becomes, dare I say, obvious? Let me read a verse from the Bible. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. That's Romans chapter 1, verse 20. I really hope that you might recognise that what we see around us does actually point to a designer. It's what many like to call intelligent design, rather than something that came about by a series of wonderful chance happenings. I'm a medical doctor with postgraduate qualifications in surgery, ophthalmology and the treatment of addiction. I say that to emphasise that I am well educated by most people's standards at least, and especially in the sciences. And I want to point out that my faith is in no way contradicted by my scientific education. In fact, it's the complete reverse. I maintain that my faith in God is substantiated by science, as hopefully you're about to see. And that's not to say I don't have questions. I have all sorts of questions. There is so much mystery, so much that I don't understand, as is the case for most of us. But we really don't have to understand everything to understand what's most important. I also want to stress that I'm not pushing any particular Christian denomination. There are very many different expressions of Christianity. Many are great and some are not so great. But I simply want to say here that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and I hope you'll see that I have excellent grounds for that conviction. Incidentally, I personally have never not believed. I have never needed to be convinced that God exists. But I love the fact that faith in God, and in particular faith in Jesus Christ, is very rational. I'm thankful that you're watching this. Please bear with me and please consider my case for faith very seriously. I want to quote C.S. Lewis here. Lewis was a great scholar of both Oxford and Cambridge in the last century, and he's a well-known author. You may at least know of his children's books, the Chronicles of Narnia in particular. Lewis, who by the way was once himself a militant atheist, said this about Christianity. Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, is of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. So what I'm about to present is either total rubbish and not worthy of your time, or it's of vital importance. But please don't consider it as maybe something you just might leave for later. So my goal here is to show you that there is strong evidence, really strong evidence that is rooted in science and history. Firstly, for a belief in intelligent design, for a creator. That is to say, our earth and our existence and all that we see around us could not have simply come about by chance. And secondly, I want to show you that there is actually overwhelming evidence for the historical Jesus Christ. There are multiple pieces of evidence to confirm that Jesus of Nazareth lived and walked the earth, that he was executed and died by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans, but also, however hard this may be to take, that he was resurrected. He rose again from death. And the significance of the resurrection is that it substantiates the historical claim of Jesus to be God. What I'm saying is that God became man and showed us what God is actually like, and also showed us how we can know him. Again, please bear with me if that all sounds fanciful, but I maintain that it's actually the most important thing in life. So what I want to do in this presentation is make something of a case for the defence. Consider yourself to be a member of the jury in a court case, and I want you to see me to be a lawyer for the defence of a faith in Jesus. This presentation is something of an overview of my case. There are many witnesses and pieces of evidence that I want to refer you to. I'll give you links to some videos and documents, and I seriously hope that you'll be inspired to look into this all more deeply. But for now, consider this session, this overview, arguing that God is not hidden from view. He's standing in plain sight. The case for the prosecution has been very well made to anyone who's lived in the West. Our culture has been seriously impacted by a Western scientific mindset, and you, like many others, have probably grown up accepting materialism. That is to say, a belief that everything, all that we are, even our consciousness, can be somehow explained in terms of matter and energy. Most of us have been brought up to accept Darwinism and evolutionary biology as fact. But I want to challenge what you have been taught very much from a scientific perspective. Darwin was born back during the Napoleonic Wars, during the reign of King George III. His theory of evolution always was only a theory that Darwin himself knew was built on assumptions that he couldn't confirm. I want to show you that we now know that those assumptions have proved to be false. In over 1.5 centuries since the publication of The Origin of Species, we have discovered so much about cellular and molecular biology, information that Darwin could hardly have imagined. See the theory of evolutionary biology as a tower of blocks. I'm planning to show you that several foundation blocks, assumptions upon which the theory is based, have to be removed. And with those gone, and by using Darwin's own words, I'll show you why the tower, the theory of evolution by natural selection, absolutely breaks down. Again, Darwin studied science 200 years ago. He went to medical school way back in 1826. I'll show you why Darwin himself, had he been armed with our 21st century knowledge of science and geology, would almost certainly have considered his own theory as completely untenable. He only ever called it a theory, which he knew was based on untested assumptions. I believe the only reason so many of us hold on to the theory and even consider evolution of new species by natural selection as fact is that Darwin's theory supports a worldview that doesn't acknowledge God. By the way, and for what it's worth, Charles Darwin and I share a birthday. We were both born on the 12th of February, which is now called Darwin Day. And I was born way back in 1959, which was actually the centenary of the publication of his famous book. So I really don't want to demean Darwin. He was a brilliant man, but he was constrained by the significant limitations of the understanding that there was in his day. I also want to make an important distinction here between what is known as microevolution as opposed to macroevolution. Microevolution is the adaptation and changes that can take place within a particular species. Darwin observed adaptation of finches, variation in the shape of their beaks. We saw changes in the coronavirus during the pandemic, for example. We see the influenza virus adapting to get around immunity that develops from previous infections or vaccinations. We sadly keep seeing different bacteria becoming resistant to antibiotics. But adaptation within a species really is a million miles from Darwinian evolution, which is the transition of one species to a higher form. I'm going to show you that macroevolution, the development of greater biological complexity, or the development of new species by natural selection, is scientifically impossible. I'm also not denying that life on Earth has changed over many, many years. Dinosaurs once walked the Earth. They've gone. And new species have taken their place. But these changes can simply not be explained by Darwin's theory, as many would like to believe. Instead, I hope you'll come to see that our existence and the existence of other life forms could only have come about as a result of the intentions of a great and powerful mind, a designer, a creator, one that I and many others call God. So as I put myself forward as the lawyer for the defence of faith, let me introduce you to Richard Dawkins, because I'm putting him forward as the lawyer for the prosecution. Professor Richard Dawkins, a biologist at the University of Oxford, is perhaps the most famous atheist of our day. It's fair to say that Dawkins has ridiculed a belief in a creator. He said some very strong things about those who have faith in God. But here is one of his more charitable quotations. "Isn't it enough to see that a garden is beautiful without having to believe that there are fairies at the bottom of it too?" He also repeatedly challenges the historicity of Jesus, which is actually very surprising for an academic who considers himself to be an authority on religion. I have spent many hours listening to Professor Dawkins, listening to his talks, watching him in debates, as well as reading some of his writings. And whilst he has acknowledged the possibility that Jesus lived, he's cast much doubt on our historical knowledge about him. In a widely heard podcast in which he was interviewed by Joe Rogan, Dawkins said these words, "Jesus, if he ever lived." We talk about certain characters in history, the likes of Robin Hood and Maid Marian, people who may or may not have lived, and if they did live, we have little historical evidence for their lives. But unlike many legendary figures and other religious leaders about whom we have little, if any, historical data, Jesus of Nazareth happened to live and die in an age of extraordinary literacy. Even putting the Bible accounts to one side, I'll show you that historians know a great deal about his life and death from a number of sources, and from that we'll look at what we know about the period following his death. Richard Dawkins, if he were to be intellectually honest, would know this. Again, thank you for your time, and please bear with me. I know that I may not get you to change your mind, and that's okay, but at the very least, I'm confident I'll get you to recognise that belief in design, belief in creation as opposed to evolution, is very, very different to believing in fairies. And whatever conclusion you come to regarding the man Jesus Christ, also known as Jesus of Nazareth, after hearing what I have to say, you'll surely recognise that he is absolutely not a legendary figure like Robin Hood. Whatever you choose to believe, I hope you'll be able to acknowledge that there's not only a very strong historical case for his life and for his death, but also there is strong evidence for his resurrection from the dead. Okay, so you're on the jury and I'm defending a case for faith. Before you hear the lawyer's opening statement, imagine the judge has given some advice to the jury, as often happens. Suppose he said 3 things to you. Number 1, consider the evidence as a whole and avoid over-focusing on one piece of evidence. Imagine we're trying to determine whether a suspect was actually at a crime scene. There may be CCTV footage, fingerprints, witness statements, and perhaps documentary evidence that suggests that the defendant was at the scene of the crime. For each piece of evidence, one of the lawyers may try to cast doubt upon its validity. He or she might, for example, say that the CCTV footage is grainy and therefore not entirely reliable. But despite this, as often happens, it's when all the evidence is considered as a whole that the jury may easily come to a conclusion that is beyond reasonable doubt, that the defendant was indeed at the crime scene. I believe the evidence I'm going to show you, especially when properly examined, will help you reach a clear verdict which is beyond reasonable doubt. As I was saying, let's not miss seeing the forest for the trees. My case rests on several arguments taken together. The second piece of advice the judge may give you is to beware of presumption. Presumption, presupposition and prejudice have led to countless wrong convictions down the years. We all view life from our own particular viewpoint. I know I do. So please examine whether part of your reasoning, and perhaps the reasoning of those who have taught you evolutionary biology, may be skewed by the simple presumption that there is no God, and the belief that miracles simply don't happen because you don't believe they fit in with the laws of science. To be honest, I believe the whole case for atheism rests on presumption that there is no God. The consideration that the existence of God is impossible is, I believe, the only thing that makes Darwin's highly unlikely theory sound anything like plausible. Many are holding on to the flawed theory of evolution by random mutation and natural selection simply because they don't want to believe the alternative. You may know these words, supposedly spoken by Sherlock Holmes. When you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. So let me ask you, have you eliminated the existence of God as impossible and thereby found yourself believing a theory that is not only improbable, but actually more impossible than the existence of God. To back up what I'm saying here, let me read a line from the preface of a book by Richard Dawkins, a book I'll refer to later. Dawkins states in his preface that he writes the book to persuade the reader not just that the Darwinian worldview happens to be true, but that it is the only known theory that could, in principle, solve the mystery of our existence. There seems to be a clear presumption here that there is no God, which gives credence to the statement that the Darwinian worldview has to be the only one that works. The final piece of advice the judge is giving to the jury, similar to what I've already said about presumption, is to beware of confirmation bias. We can all easily slip into confirmation bias, especially on matters such as the existence or non-existence of God. And along with warnings from the judge to beware of presumption, let's also watch out for where we are disregarding evidence that doesn't fit in with what we want to believe, and conversely choosing to believe weak or flawed evidence that does support what we want to believe. So here's a very quick overview of my overview so you can see where I'm going. I hope this helps. This is how I'll argue my case. Section 1, I'll briefly show you some very eminent scientific voices that see design, that is the very existence of God, very much from a scientific point of view. Section 2, I'll again briefly refer to the beginning of our universe, the so-called Big Bang, and also very briefly to what's called the fine-tuning argument, both as evidence of design. But thirdly, section 3, I'll take a little time to show you 4 flawed assumptions in Darwin's theory of evolution by random mutation and natural selection. I'll show you 4 reasons why it just doesn't make sense to believe we could possibly have simply evolved. I'll give you good reasons for believing that Darwin himself would have not proposed his theory had he known what we now know. As I said, with these 4 foundation blocks removed, the tower of evolutionary biology has to fall. Section 4, I'll briefly point you to some very strong evidence from a historical point of view for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Consider this, many of us have probably disregarded the possibility of miracles, including resurrection, because supernatural events do not fit in with our perception of the laws of science. But doesn't the existence of God suddenly make miracles possible? And so, with that said, I want to show you some hard historical facts, not assumptions, nor theories, but actual historical facts that are completely accepted and acknowledged by all serious scholars of ancient history. And these facts point clearly to the bodily resurrection of Jesus to anyone who has a mind that is open to the possibility of miracles. And remember, in the way that the case for God makes miracles possible, the case for the resurrection is further evidence for the case for God. Section 5, I'll show you that Jesus is actually the Jewish Messiah. He's the man that the Jewish scriptures predicted centuries before his birth. No scholar would deny that the ancient Jewish writings point to the coming of someone referred to as the Messiah. Well, I'm looking forward to showing you why Jesus of Nazareth was and is that Messiah. Something that I consider rather mind-blowing is the fact that these scriptures incredibly predicted that the Messiah would be killed around the year 33 AD. And even more than that, actually in the month of the Passover, which happens to be the time of year when followers of Jesus celebrate the resurrection. The biblical accounts of the life of Jesus, by the way, were recorded in the ancient Greek language. The word Christ is simply the Greek translation of the Hebrew word for Messiah. So the name Jesus Christ declares Jesus to be the Messiah. And finally, in section 6, I'll point you to some modern miracles, actually including verifiable resurrection from death, as well as changed lives that all very powerfully confirm the message that God is real and that Jesus is the Messiah raised from the dead. In each section, I'll be giving you some further pointers for investigation. Let's say that will be an opportunity for you to hear the actual witnesses separately, as it would be in an actual court case. It's not as though these are the only arguments for God. There is a strong moral argument for God, and there are also other powerful philosophical arguments that have brought many to faith. But I'm not a philosopher, so I'll mostly stick to science and history, where I feel a lot more at home. I referred earlier to confirmation bias. Along the way, I want you to note that many eminent and convinced former atheists have become theists. People do change their positions. These are people who would not have wanted to believe in God, but have chosen to do so from evidence in areas such as molecular and cellular biology or astrophysics. The evidence of history has also brought many to become followers of Jesus. Again, please bear with me. This is important stuff. So, section 1, let's hear a few scientific voices. For sure, many scientists are atheists, but very many eminent scientists see a revelation of God in science. Albert Einstein, considered to be the most brilliant physicist on Earth until his death in 1955, said these words: "Everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, a spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which we, with our modest powers, must feel humble." He also said, "The more I study science, the more I believe in God." If you're a scientist, I suggest that you have to be very brave to disagree with Einstein. Brian Josephson was a professor of physics at Cambridge and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1973 for work on superconductivity and quantum tunneling. He says, "Intelligent design is valid science." Charles Townes is another Nobel Prize winner, and his work resulted in the development of the laser. He said, "Intelligent design, as one sees it from a scientific point of view, seems to be real." I hope you'll be agreeing to consider the existence of God as nothing like believing in fairies. And just one more for now, Isaac Newton. He's considered to be the father of modern science, and he's famously described the laws of motion and gravity that govern the orbits of our planets. But he suggested that someone had to have initiated the orbits within our solar system. Our Earth is not orbiting the Sun by chance. Newton wrote, "Thus, this most beautiful system of the Sun, planets and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being." So moving on, secondly, let us very briefly look at an argument for design from beginnings. The very first words of the Bible, the Christian scriptures, are these: "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." We now know with certainty that the universe had a beginning, the so-called Big Bang. No astrophysicist would doubt this. The universe is clearly expanding, which points to a time when it wasn't there, or when what was there was at least relatively tiny. So what caused the first explosion? A very unusual explosion. Explosions usually lead to chaos, but somehow the universe has incredible order. This is a big subject, and I'm not going to say anything more on this other than point to the massive question about the beginning of the universe, which I believe points to a designer. What initiated both the beginning and the expansion of the universe? Consider, what was it that caused every planet, moon, star and galaxy that now span unimaginable distances to come from just one point, or even from nothing? To me and many others, God is the only explanation. And let me suggest that it takes enormous faith to believe that everything you see and cannot see on Earth and in the night sky was once nothing. But this is not an area of expertise for me, so I'll move on and even more briefly mention the argument for God's existence from what is referred to as the fine-tuning argument. There are so very many fortunate coincidences, if you like, that make life possible. There are numerous physical constants that just happen to be right for life and are either a happy accident or perhaps they point to a creator. Let me quote Stephen Hawking here. "The laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life." I fully acknowledge that many scientists, Stephen Hawking among them, have not been persuaded to believe in God from such observations. So I won't try and use the Big Bang and the so-called fine-tuning argument by themselves to convince you, but do please bear them in mind for later when you look at the bigger picture. And with that, I move on to section 3, to consider life, and to look at what an atheist absolutely has to believe if he or she is going to be true to themselves in saying there is no God. In this section, I want to show you 4 flawed assumptions of Darwin's theory, and I'm going to argue, citing Darwin himself, that with our 21st century understandings, Darwin's 19th century theory really is no longer plausible. The first assumption is that life could have started spontaneously. Life as we know it is totally dependent upon the existence of DNA or RNA, what we call nucleic acids. Every life form that we know about is driven by these highly complex molecules. 2 things that are special about nucleic acids are firstly that they are capable of replication, and secondly, they have the genetic information or coding that gives cells the capability of producing proteins that in turn will form new cells. An atheist has to believe that the first nucleic acid somehow came about by chance and somehow began replicating. In a minute, I'll show you that that is a belief in something that is literally physically impossible without God. It's no less a miracle than healing the blind, even raising the dead. But before I do that, just let's pause and digress very slightly to consider the second thing I said about DNA. It has coding, what we call genes, the genetic information that's required to produce proteins that are needed for new cell formation. The simplest cell that we know of that is actually capable of replicating by itself is a simple bacterium, which we call mycoplasma, which has over 1,000 genes. And this simplest set of genes requires 1.3 megabytes. That's 1.3 million individual pieces of genetic information. There are 4 separate chemicals that convey genetic information within DNA, which we call nucleotides. So for the coding of the very simplest of cells, we need 1.3 million nucleotides to somehow spontaneously come together all in the right order. You might like to argue that the mycoplasma had an even simpler predecessor, but it couldn't have been much simpler. There are life forms that are more simple than mycoplasma, but these are parasites, including viruses, and they will only replicate within a higher life form, which would have had to have occurred first. But consider this. DNA is pure information, exactly in the same way as computer software is information. More than that, it's an advanced form of information. In fact, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted these words: "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created." The existence of information, whether handwritten or typed, whether written onto a computer hard drive or stored in a strand of DNA, tells us that there was someone somewhere who wrote, inputted, or programmed that information. The scientific word used in describing the initial process of DNA replication is transcription. The very use of this word, transcription, acknowledges communication of information. Let's be honest, the existence of DNA yells at us that there is an intelligent mind behind life as we know it. But that was a digression, albeit an important digression. Back to where I was. If you're an atheist, you have to believe that before the first cell came into being, DNA or RNA came into being. So given the right mix of chemicals and the right conditions, we could try to consider whether a DNA molecule could spontaneously have come about. The probability is infinitesimally small. Remember the 1.3 megabytes of information for the simplest replicating life form. As I've mentioned, there are 4 nucleotides. So for the DNA for the first cell, we need something like 1.3 million nucleotides falling into place in the right order, 1 chance in 4 to the power of 1.3 million. But even with this tiny mathematical possibility, there is a very big problem, a very big but. That strand of nucleic acid, even if it did fall into place by chance, very simply could not have replicated without the pre-existence of other organic material, proteins in particular, enzymes, such as transcriptases to enable transcription. They are absolutely crucial for nucleic acid replication. But these enzymes could not have been around to enable the first nucleic acid to replicate because because they would have needed pre-existing DNA to code for them. The first cell could not have come into being without a pre-existing nucleic acid. The first nucleic acid, even if it could have come about by chance, could not have replicated without a pre-existing cell. To propose that life could have started spontaneously without God, without a great mind behind it, is to propose a simply impossible situation, a situation that is as equally impossible as any other miracle described in the Bible. DNA and miracles are both impossible without God. I could rest my case here, but it gets worse because no bacterium will ever replicate without nutrients. And nutrients which enable cellular replication are organic matter which come about from at least some degree of pre-existing biodiversity. With his early 19th century understanding of biology, Darwin in good faith proposed the spontaneous occurrence of the first cell in a warm primordial pond, believing it to be possible because when he studied science, he knew virtually nothing about cellular biology and absolutely nothing about nucleic acids. With regards to the more recent understanding of the complexities of cellular biology, read a recent tweet by Richard Dawkins following an animation showing the replication of DNA. Animations like this knock me sideways with wonder at the miniaturized intricacy of the data processing machinery in the living cell. We know now that every living cell is actually a complex chemical factory, but an atheist has to believe that the miniaturized intricacy of the data processing machinery all fell into place by chance to form the first living replicating cell. With regards to the mathematical improbability of DNA forming spontaneously, assuming the right mix of chemicals and perfect conditions, atheists such as Richard Dawkins have liked to invoke the infinite monkey theorem. This states that a monkey hitting keys at random on a typewriter keyboard for an infinite amount of time will almost surely type any given text, such as the complete works of William Shakespeare. In case you're interested, by the way, Shakespeare's complete works amount to 5 megabytes of information. Well, as we have seen, DNA by itself is of no value. It needs enzymes, cells. The cells need nutrients which come from pre-existing diversity. But that aside, time is not the friend of evolution. We've discussed the fact that the universe is governed by laws. Well, the theory of evolution actually flies in the face of one such law, the second law of thermodynamics, also known as the law of entropy. Stated simply, this law describes how there is a continual shift from complexity to simplicity. Chemicals as well as non-living structures decompose. Evolutionary biologists have wanted to believe that given enough time, the various components of DNA would have come together to form a long chain, all in the right order, literally many hundreds of thousands of nucleotides in exactly the right order to code for life. But sadly for the infinite monkey, these complex prebiotic chemicals, the nucleotides, the proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, would simply not have waited around for the right time to all come together. Even if they possibly could have formed spontaneously, they would have been busy decomposing before they had a chance to spontaneously come together. Imagine components of an orange representing prebiotic chemicals. We might like to think that given enough time and perfect conditions, they would somehow come together to form an orange which represents a nicely formed molecule of DNA. The second law of thermodynamics, the law of entropy, clearly tells us that the components would be decomposing long before the orange had a chance to form. With reference to the impossibility of the spontaneous formation and replication of DNA, impossible that is without God, I now want to introduce you to Antony Flew, who was very well known internationally as an outspoken atheist. He would publicly debate with Christians, as Dawkins has done in more recent years. Antony Flew caused an enormous stir in 2004 with the publication of this book, There Is a God. Note how the title changes from There Is No God to There Is a God, how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. Hear carefully what Antony Flew wrote. Although I was once sharply critical of the argument to design, I have since come to see that when correctly formatted, this argument constitutes a persuasive case for the existence of God. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. My one and only piece of relevant evidence for a God is the apparent impossibility of providing a naturalistic theory of the origin from DNA of the first reproducing species. Some have sadly suggested that Flew was losing his faculties by the time he wrote the book, but I've seen plenty of YouTube footage which I make available to you showing that he was well able to articulately explain his reasoning. If you're in any doubt as to the impossibility of the first reproducing species without God, please listen to this excellent one-hour discussion between two engaging and eminent scientists, Dr. Stephen Meyer and Dr. James Torr. I'll be giving you the link to this important video. So Darwinian evolution rests on the assumption of the spontaneous appearance of the first replicating cell, which we now know to be impossible at least, without reference to God. So let's now move on to another assumption for the Darwinian worldview. I'm now going to show you that the complexity of life simply cannot be explained by Darwin's theory, despite what you may have been taught at school or university, or maybe despite what you may have heard on a David Attenborough documentary. Let's have a very quick consideration of Darwin's theory of evolution by random mutation and natural selection. The crucial point is that every change in the development of an organ or species has to have what we call a selective advantage, something that gives a plant or a creature an advantage over other related organisms. We then get what's referred to as the survival of the fittest. For example, the animal with the slightly better muscles, bone shape, teeth, sharpness, whatever it is, will survive at the expense of those that don't have those attributes. Now please bear with me here, and hopefully you'll see where I'm going. I want to be slightly facetious and describe the evolution of a meat cleaver from a simple kitchen knife. So we start with a small kitchen knife which mutates to produce offspring with slightly sharper and longer blades which have an obvious selective advantage. And over the years, with successive small changes, we can see the theory of how we might get a meat cleaver. I'm going to contrast that with the supposed evolution of a watch. You may well know why I'm using this example. It's because of the famous argument by William Paley, an English theologian whose life precedes that of Charles Darwin's by a few years. Paley argued a case for the existence of God by saying that if he found a watch on the heath, he would know from the design of the watch that somewhere there is a watchmaker. By looking at the design seen in nature, Paley argues that there has to be a designer, what we call God. And his argument is called natural theology. The really important thing about the watch, really important thing about the watch is that none of its individual components have any selective advantage alone. Whereas we saw a case for the evolution of a meat cleaver, there is no possible explanation for the appearance of an individual cog or spring. No individual watch cog serves any purpose by itself. Rather, the various components only have value when they're all neatly and carefully set together. If you have a functioning watch and you take out one cog, it stops. It dies, if you like. Evolution by random mutation and natural selection seems to make sense when applied to the evolution of the meat cleaver, where we're considering a single, simple characteristic. Let's apply that to nature. We can consider an argument for understanding how a giraffe's neck slowly becomes longer over the years. But the theory simply does not work for complexity, where there are multiple components, each which have no value in isolation. That is to say, none of the components individually have a selective advantage. In a minute, I'm going to show you that there are an enormous number of biological systems that are like the watch, systems with individual parts that serve no purpose by themselves. But let's first hear from Charles Darwin on the matter. And let's remember again, in fairness to Darwin, the limitations of knowledge nearly 200 years ago when he studied science at medical school. There was very little understanding of the workings, the physiology of various organs. With that in mind, hear what Darwin had to say. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. I'll show you that it is clear that Darwin's theory absolutely does break down using this particular criterion in relation to complexity. I first want to introduce you now to another of my witnesses, Dr. Gunter Bechly, an eminent German scientist with his PhD from the University of Tübingen. He's an expert in prehistoric dragonflies, and there are species actually named after him. He and I met last year on Zoom. For years, Gunter would have described himself as an atheist. Interestingly, he had a particular dislike of Christians. Whilst working as curator in the State Museum of Natural History in Stuttgart, he made what he called a fatal mistake. He read a book showing the impossibility of biological complexity without design. In particular, Gunter was won over to theism through understanding the complexity of the flagellum, a tail-like structure that helps certain bacteria to move. The flagellum has what is in effect a small motor, and again, the individual components of this motor have no value of their own. These components could not have had any individual selective advantage. But when all assemble together, we have a mechanism that drives the flagellum and allows the bacterium to move. Please watch my interview with Gunter. He explains how he had no interest in believing in God, but changed when he realised the impossibility of complexity in nature by Darwin's theory. Sometime later, and very reluctantly, Gunter also became a believer in Jesus Christ based on historical evidence that I'll allude to later. For a minute, let's also consider the eye. I have studied the human eye to a high level, and I've worked as an eye doctor. I love the evidence of design in the human eye. For example, there are multiple parts of the eye that will only work, and therefore they could only have had any selective value in conjunction with corresponding nerve systems in the brain. Conversely, the complex systems of nerves located in various parts of the brain only have value alongside the coexistence of the eye itself. I've watched Richard Dawkins trying to explain the evolution of the eye by natural means. He addresses the issue of complexity, but his presentation goes nowhere near explaining the human eye's numerous, separate and totally interdependent components, which to me are clear indicators of a creator God. There are so many examples I could give. One is the pupillary response to light. The muscle that constricts the pupil in bright light would be of no value and therefore have no selective advantage without the nerves that supply it. And those particular nerves that stimulate constriction would have had no selective advantage without the pupillary muscle. Blood clotting is another example. When we cut ourselves, we take for granted that our blood will clot. But the clotting mechanism is actually extremely complex. There are numerous proteins called factors that are all necessary for what we call the blood clotting cascade. If one of these individual factors is missing, blood doesn't clot. This is what happens, for example, in the inherited disease haemophilia. People with this condition are unable to produce factor 7, which is just one of the 12 factors needed for blood to clot. And without advanced treatment, these people sadly die. The point is, the blood clotting mechanism could not possibly have evolved by natural means because the individual factors are only of value when all the factors are present together. That is to say, none of the factors have individual selective advantage. But a wonderful argument for design from complexity is sexual reproduction. Try to consider how sexual reproduction could possibly have evolved by natural means. Firstly, ask yourself, how could male or female anatomy have evolved apart from design? Which came first, male or female? What is the evolutionary value in the development of a male characteristic without a pre-existing female characteristic? That is to say, there could not have been any selective advantage for the development of either of the sexes without the pre-existence of the other. But secondly, both male and female anatomy need very separate physiological systems to function. For example, the complex hormonal cycles in female mammals. Male and female anatomy is operated, if you like, by very distinct mechanisms, which very simply can in no way be accounted for by random mutation and natural selection. Thirdly, even if you somehow had an organism with separate male and female anatomy and the necessary physiology, This would all be of zero value without the pre-existing process called meiosis. This is the formation of eggs in the female and sperm in the male. It's an incredibly complex formation of special cells, each with half of the genetic material needed to produce an offspring. Again, it's a wonderful illustration of a masterly design. But even if distinct male and female anatomy and physiology and the process of meiosis could all be accounted for by natural means, and really, surely we do know that this is not possible, but even so, with all those things in place, reproduction would simply not happen without instinct or desire to reproduce. In our existence as being male and female, we have what I believe is glaringly obvious evidence that we have been designed and we are not here by chance. The Bible tells us that we are wonderfully and fearfully made. We've been beautifully designed, and part of that incredible design is that God has created us mammals and the various other classes within the animal kingdom to be male and female. If you've any doubt on this matter of gender and reproduction, please read the article attached to this presentation by American scientists Dr. Brad Hurrub and Dr. Bert Thompson. It's called Evolutionary Theories on Gender and Sexual Reproduction. My impression is that Charles Darwin was very honest about the limitations of his theory. He himself recognised that he was proposing a theory which needed further confirmation, and as I've pointed out, he himself said the theory would break down if it could be shown that the complex systems could not have evolved by random mutation and natural selection. Given the scientific limitations of his day, I'm absolutely confident that Charles Darwin, from his own words, would have stopped in his tracks if he had known what we now know about biological complexity. Let me read you again the line from the preface to one of Richard Dawkins' books. The book is called The Blind Watchmaker, a response to William Paley's argument for design. Dawkins wrote that Darwin's theory is the only known theory that could, in principle, solve the mystery of existence. It is the only known theory for someone who has the presupposition that there is no God. And to use Darwin's own phraseology, it's a theory that has absolutely broke down with our current knowledge about molecular and cellular biology, as well as the complexity we now see in biology. And now just a very quick word about fossils, and we'll consider another assumption, a third false assumption upon which Darwinian evolution rests. That is that the fossil evidence supports evolution. I was taught in my biology classes at school that the fossil record was in keeping with Darwin's theory, and I had no reason to doubt it. It's very easy to simply believe something that you were taught as fact at school, but the reality is that Darwin himself knew that the fossil record that already existed in his day did not support his theory. The fossil record now, as then, clearly shows that there was what we call an explosion of biological diversity on the Earth about 541 million years ago. This is called the Cambrian explosion. Regarding this particular feature within the fossil record, known to geologists 200 years ago, Darwin wrote, "I can give no satisfactory answer, so the case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained." Darwin postulated, however, that if his theory were correct, new fossils would be found showing the ancestors of the various fossilized species that seemingly suddenly appeared when they did. And many more fossils have been found. More than that, we now have fossils of microorganisms, microfossils. We have so much more information than Darwin had, and the evidence from further discoveries and research is that there were not ancestors to the creatures that appeared in the Cambrian explosion. If there had been, we would definitely have seen them by now. But actually, in addition to the lack of ancestors, we're also missing countless transitional fossils that Darwin predicted we would find if his theory were correct. Let me quote Darwin again, because he himself particularly saw the lack of transitional fossils as a serious problem. Darwin actually wrote that the lack of transitional fossils is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory. I'm quite confident that if Charles Darwin had known that after another 150 years of fossil research, ancestors of all the new species that appeared within the Cambrian explosion would not be found, If he had known that fossils of transitional species would not be found, again, these are fossils that absolutely should be there if the theory is correct, and if he had had access to electron microscopy to examine microfossils, his book, The Origin of Species, would never have been written, let alone published. I introduced you earlier to Dr. Gunter Bechly. Fossils is Gunter's area of expertise. As I've told you, he's a renowned paleontologist, and I invite you to listen to him explaining how the fossil record provides further evidence against Darwin's theory. There's actually yet another, a fourth important flawed assumption that I want to mention, the assumption that there's been enough time for sequential beneficial mutations to account for our evolution. I'm giving you a link to a discussion about what is known as Haldanes Dilemma. It's actually a massive problem for evolutionary biologists. John Haldane was a British evolutionary geneticist who back in 1957 calculated that there simply had not been enough time to account for evolution. And note that Haldane was not a man of faith. The document explains how, firstly, mutations are very rarely beneficial. In the same way that software corruptions usually slow down or prevent computer programs from running, corruptions in DNA coding are much more likely to lead to an inherited disease or death than something beneficial. But secondly, and most importantly, given the mutation rate observed in nature alongside the generation times, for example 20 years in humans, plus the amount of actual DNA changes required to significantly lead to a change in structure, there is simply not enough time, even over the millions of years of Earth's history, to account for anything like the diversity we see in the animal and plant world. Let's take humans as an important example. It's believed by evolutionists that humans and apes, such as chimpanzees, evolved from a common ancestor that lived between 5 and 10 million years ago. But that's simply not enough time. Bear in mind that with a human generation, say every 20 years, 10 million years equates to only 500,000 generations. There's a 4% difference between humans and chimpanzees in terms of DNA composition. At first, that might not seem much, but each strand of our DNA has 3 billion nucleotides. And 4% of 3 billion nucleotides is still 120 million nucleotides. And most mutations involve a change in just one nucleotide. Even a beneficial mutation every generation would not go anywhere near explaining the massive difference between humans and the supposed shared ancestor that we would have had with chimpanzees. And it gets worse. Human DNA is 50% longer than chimpanzee DNA. Chimps have a mere 2 billion nucleotides in their DNA. Not only do we need time for a change of 120 million nucleotides, we also need a massive increase in the amount of DNA needed to form humans. We also need to remember too that for the formation of a new species we need mutations that are so beneficial that those who have any given mutation will survive at the expense of those that don't have it. Let me add, John Haldane argued for what is called a beneficial substitution every 300 generations, not even every generation. But with other foundation blocks removed, with the other flawed assumptions, the Tower of Blocks fell a while back. So let's move on. And so we come to section 4, historical evidence for Jesus Christ, the man, Jesus of Nazareth. Not simply evidence for his existence, but for his life, his death by crucifixion, and his rising, his resurrection from the dead, as impossible or maybe as absurd as that may seem. I'm going to focus on hard historical facts, but regardless of anyone's faith position, the accounts of the life of Jesus in the Bible at the very least deserve to be considered for what they are: ancient documents easily dated to being from the 1st century, written mostly by people who at least claimed to be eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus. We do know from the science of textual criticism that these accounts can easily be dated to within a few decades of the death of Jesus, between 35 and 55 years to be precise. This is highly significant, and let me first dismiss any suggestion that the time lapse makes them any less significant. Just very recently, the BBC released a documentary about the Falklands War of 1982, 40 years on. It used eyewitness testimonies of those that were there, who vividly and accurately describe the events. no one for a second would doubt those particular accounts for such a momentous event simply because a few decades had passed. If it weren't for the accounts of miracles, including resurrections, the Gospel accounts would simply be regarded as highly reliable historical documents for various reasons. Luke's account is painstakingly accurate and written by someone who comes across as a very trustworthy contemporary historian. But because some do disregard them because they do describe miracles, we'll put the Gospel accounts to one side for now and concentrate on what no serious historian doubts. Firstly, no historian will doubt the death by crucifixion of Jesus. There is plenty of solid evidence outside of the Bible for this. We have, for example, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian and politician. Tacitus is widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by modern scholars. He certainly had no sympathy for Jesus and his followers. He described Christianity as a dangerous superstition, but he gives us some clear evidence that backs up some of the New Testament accounts of Jesus' life. Tacitus wrote, Christus had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus. Okay, the next totally unchallenged historical fact, something we know a great deal about, is that in the years that followed the death of Jesus, the spread of Christianity was explosive, and there was subsequently an extensive persecution of Christians by the Romans under the Emperor Nero. We do know from different sources that Christians were not liked by the Romans, and they were considered a threat because they did not acknowledge the deity of Caesar. Remember, Tacitus described Christianity as a dangerous superstition. The Roman Emperor Nero blamed Christians for the Great Fire of Rome in AD 64, resulting in a well-documented persecution that led to a massive number of horrendous public executions of Christians who refused to renounce their faith. This explosion of faith and the subsequent persecution is very important. But what is a really important, crucial, and an uncontested historical fact is that people who lived with Jesus, people who actually knew him, at the very least believed that they had seen him alive very soon after his crucifixion. All historians, all serious historians, including those who are sceptical about resurrection, accept that we can date to within a couple of years of the crucifixion that a significant number of people who knew Jesus believed they had had an experience of seeing him alive after his execution. This is a simple historical fact. For example, we do know for sure from sources outside of the Bible that James, believed to be the brother of Jesus, was martyred by stoning in AD 62 alongside several other believers. The account of this event by Roman historian Josephus is undisputed, and it shows us one man who was so convinced that he had seen the risen Jesus that he was willing to die for that conviction. I hope you see how significant this is. But in addition to the accounts of the death of James, we have a major confirmation of others who at least believed they had encountered Jesus raised from the dead. And that comes from the writings of a man called Saul. By normal historical methods, we can be sure Paul was a first century Jewish scholar. Some of his writings are included in the Bible. But regardless of how skeptical you may be about miracles, certain letters of Paul, in particular one written to people in Corinth, is undoubtedly by him. This letter to the Corinthians makes clear to all historians, skeptics and believers alike, that we have first-hand testimony that immediately after the death of Jesus, his close followers, in particular James, Peter and John, believed they had seen him risen from the dead. We're not talking about religious tradition, legend or vague belief. This is undisputed historical fact. No different to the undisputed historical fact that Christopher Columbus, for example, crossed the Atlantic Ocean in 1492. A number of historians sceptical of the possibility of resurrection have argued that the followers of Jesus had had a shared hallucination, but none doubt that James, Peter and John believed they had seen Jesus alive after his crucifixion. Following the execution of Jesus, we can be absolutely sure that men who had lived with Jesus immediately testified to his resurrection from the dead. Again, we can also be sure that the experience they had was so strong, so convincing, that they were willing to die for that conviction. James was undoubtedly martyred for his conviction. And again, from a neutral historical perspective, both Peter and Paul were almost certainly martyred for what they believed they had experienced. To grasp the power of the historical evidence, please listen to the talks on video that I'm referring you to. The obvious conclusion to anyone who accepts the existence of God and the possibility of miracles is that Jesus had indeed risen from the grave. There's actually so much more that could be said. I haven't argued for an empty tomb as yet, because admittedly that's not a historical fact. We cannot prove that the tomb of Jesus was empty. What we can say is that it is highly improbable that the body of Jesus was present after the crucifixion. It would surely have been produced to dispel any rumour of resurrection by the authorities had it still been in the tomb. Furthermore, the biblical accounts by men purporting to be eyewitnesses to the life, death and resurrection of Jesus are actually highly credible and powerful pieces of evidence once we've allowed ourselves to believe in supernatural events. Again, if you're in any doubt whatsoever, please listen to the talk by Gary Haldanes that clearly lays out the evidence for the resurrection. And I also encourage you to listen to another man, Lee Strobel, and even watch a movie about his conversion to faith. Lee was an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune and a hard-nosed, confirmed atheist. He was very upset when his wife became a Christian in the 1970s, and he set out to disprove the resurrection of Jesus in the hope that she had come to her senses. But his careful investigation brought him, begrudgingly, to the overwhelming conclusion that the resurrection is actually a historical fact. Given the historical facts alongside a case for intelligent design, I'll leave you to draw your own conclusion. Josh McDowell, an American lawyer, wrote a book on this subject called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. It's a great book, and as you investigate the evidence for the resurrection, I can also encourage you to read an article by this man. I'll give you a link for this too. But the title of this book is so good. There is so much evidence which absolutely demands a verdict. And I'm calling for a verdict which simply doesn't lean on the presumption that miracles are impossible, which in turn rests on the first presumption that God doesn't exist. Let me give you a quote here from a former professor in Auckland University, a historian who had extensively studied ancient history. I claim to be a historian. My approach to classics is historical, and I tell you that the evidence for the life, the death, and the resurrection of Christ is better authenticated than most of the facts of ancient history. At this point, I should refer to the many other documents supporting the case for the resurrection that are found in the New Testament section of the Bible. Some may have been inclined to unfairly dismiss their reliability, probably simply due to the fact that there are accounts of miracles, and, well, miracles don't happen, do they? As I've told you, we have documents that can be reliably dated to AD 55 onwards, which is very soon after the life of Jesus, and it's a fact that New Testament biblical literature has been preserved more than any other ancient literature. In fact, there are nearly 6,000 complete or fragmented original manuscripts still in existence. This is a preserved fragment of a 1st century copy of John's Gospel on display at the Rylands Gallery in Manchester. I want to quote C.S. Lewis again, also remembering that Lewis was once himself a militant atheist. But the night Lewis decided, as he put it, that God was God, he described himself with these words, perhaps the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. But I digress. C.S. Lewis challenges us to consider that Jesus has to be described in one of three ways. Taking into account from the evidence of both Christian and also ancient hostile non-Christian writings that Jesus was crucified for blasphemy, for considering himself to be God, here Lewis argued that we have to decide whether Jesus was mad, bad, or actually God. Lewis writes, "You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronising nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God." Those are the words from one former militant atheist. Now let's have a closing quote for this section regarding the resurrection from the man who said of himself that he had been the world's most notorious atheist. Anthony Flew writes, "The evidence for the resurrection is better than for claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity." So now we move on to section 5, that Jesus of Nazareth fulfilled ancient Jewish messianic prophecy in ways that absolutely could not have been engineered by any man. This alone is such powerful evidence. The scriptures of the Jewish religion point to the coming of a Messiah. Some Jews, referred to as Messianic Jews, acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, but the majority of Jews down the ages have believed that the Messiah is yet to come. But what is beyond doubt is that Judaism points to the coming of a Messiah. In the biblical accounts of the life of Jesus, there are so many messianic prophecies fulfilled by him. But there is one that is truly remarkable in that it's historically verifiable. It's written by the prophet Daniel hundreds of years before the lifetime of Jesus, which, when considered, actually dates the death of the Messiah as being the month of Passover, AD 33. Let me first stress that we know with absolute certainty that these ancient Jewish scriptures predate Jesus because we have the wonderfully preserved Dead Sea Scrolls, which include the book of Daniel. These scrolls were discovered between 1946 and 47 and are dated as being from 200 or 300 years before the time of Jesus. So before I tell you about this one particular prophecy, let me tell you that we know that in 587 BC, Jerusalem was sacked by the Babylonians and the Jewish people were taken into captivity in Babylon, hoping at some time to be restored back to Jerusalem. Let me read some words from Daniel chapter 9. Daniel writes, "From the issuing of the decree to rebuild Jerusalem, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens until the Anointed One, the Messiah, is cut off or killed." The obvious and generally accepted interpretation of this prophecy that fits perfectly with Jesus being the Messiah is that each 7 is 7 years. So we have 7 sevens and 62 sevens, which is 483 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem to the cutting off, that is, the death of the Messiah. What is staggering is that we actually have a date for when the decree to rebuild Jerusalem was made. It was 444 BC. In the Old Testament book of Nehemiah, chapter 2, we read that the decree was issued in the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Something that I find truly exciting is that we can accurately date the 20th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes. He was one of the kings of what's known as the First Persian Empire. There are numerous artifacts dating to his reign, for example his tomb and this engraving, but in particular we know a lot about him from the detailed account of the Greco-Persian Wars recorded by the Greek historian Herodotus. And so, from Herodotus and other sources, we can actually date the 20th year of the reign of King Artaxerxes to 444 BC. So Daniel's prophecy tells us that 483 years from 444 BC, the Messiah will be cut off or killed. On first glance, that seems like that points to the crucifixion of Jesus being around the Passover in AD 39. But an ancient Jewish year was a lunar year of 360 days as opposed to the 365 days and a quarter of a solar year. So when we convert the 483 lunar years to solar years, we actually have an ancient messianic prophecy pointing to the execution of the Messiah as March 33 AD. It is truly remarkable. And with a biblical understanding, the dating of the decree to the month of Nisan, the month of Passover, is the icing on the cake. The Jewish festival of Passover commemorates the protection offered to God's people by the blood of a lamb. Numerous other Old Testament prophecies liken the Messiah to a lamb. For example, the prophet Isaiah famously predicted that the Messiah would be led like a lamb to the slaughter. And Jesus is described in the New Testament as the Lamb of God. Again, it's all truly remarkable. I found the writing of one Jewish rabbi recognizing that this prophecy seemed to point to the Messiah coming in what we call the 1st century AD. But he then wrote that as Messiah hasn't come, there has to be another interpretation. Or does there? Oh well. There are other messianic prophecies we could also look at from a historical perspective. For example, a verse written in Psalm 22, written hundreds of years before the Romans conceived a crucifixion, predicts that the Messiah's hands and feet would be pierced. It's also well known that it was prophesied that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. Of course, we cannot prove that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was a virgin before she became pregnant with Jesus, but we do have reliable historical evidence that the circumstances of his birth were unusual. In particular, I refer you to evidence that there was a first century rumour that Mary, the mother of Jesus, had a premarital affair with a Roman soldier. But we move on to section 6 and make one final point. Modern day signs and miracles confirm the message of Jesus. The Bible says in several places that the message of Jesus was confirmed by miracles performed by Jesus and by his followers. I've personally witnessed numerous miracles. A significant number of people that I have prayed for have been dramatically healed, and I've witnessed other healings too. Admittedly, in many situations we only have the word of the person who's been prayed for that they're feeling better. But we do also have large amounts of objectively verifiable evidence that people have been supernaturally healed. I once recorded a video of a man being prayed for by someone I was in touch with, a man named Mark, when I was living in Keighley in West Yorkshire. This man had a shortened leg with muscle wasting, probably due to polio. He was an older man, and this was a while ago, and whilst I was filming, the leg actually grew and changed in shape. It grew in length and the muscles actually bulked out before my eyes. I saw it. Sadly, and maybe ironically, I simply cannot find the footage. You just have to take my word. But I do have this photo of someone else who'd also been prayed for by Mark. This man went into town one day wearing these shoes with a massive raised heel. But after being prayed for, he needed to buy a new pair of shoes, a pair of normal shoes. I'm also personally in touch with this woman, Marilyn Ford, an American lady who became blind aged 19 with a type of juvenile macular degeneration, most probably genetic. I've heard her story from her own lips. She lost nearly all her sight to the extent she could only discern hand movements when being examined. She certainly couldn't see the sight chart, and she was registered legally blind. This is her at a blind school where she also once taught. She later married and had a child, and she didn't know what her husband or child looked like. Then, on one particular occasion, she was prayed for by her husband. She had been prayed for many times before and nothing seemed to happen. But on this one occasion, her husband prayed and she suddenly regained her sight and saw her husband for the first time. Her child was asleep at the time, but she was suddenly able to see what her child looked like from a photograph. And to this day, she can see nearly to the bottom of the sight test chart. I have no idea why many prayers for her seemed to have no effect, and then suddenly one day a prayer led to an astounding miracle. As I've said, I personally still have many questions, but her case has been carefully documented in the medical literature with photographs, and her medical records document her original incurable diagnosis. I'll give you links to other medically verified miracles, including a book by a man called Craig Keener, which has documentary evidence including scans, x-rays and the like of numerous modern miracles. If you have any doubt about the possibility of miracles, please do watch this film, Send Proof. It's the journey of someone who himself had doubts about miracles, but he goes on to give numerous examples of supernatural healings that have hard, objective evidence. In the film, we also hear the voices of skeptics, including some Christians. Elijah Stevens, the author of the movie, shares his own journey of skepticism, but we see numerous examples of healings that have no natural explanation, healings that are also verified by independent medical professionals. But not only are people healed by God, even resurrections take place even today. I'd love you to watch an interview I undertook with Dr. Chauncey Crandall, who's an American cardiologist. On one occasion, Chauncey felt called to pray for someone he himself had previously declared dead in the emergency room. This had followed a 40-minute attempt to resuscitate him. As you'll hear, Dr. Crandall is a very experienced cardiologist who has also worked in the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. There's no doubt that the man he prayed for had died. He was 100% dead. But miraculously, after prayer, he revived. And this man, Jeff Markin, is telling his story and also pointing people to Jesus. So I asked you earlier to consider the whole picture, to step back and view the whole forest and not get too bogged down with individual trees. Consider what you actually have to believe if you want to maintain a belief in atheism, that our universe spontaneously came from nothing, that the incredible fine-tuning of the Earth and our solar system, the fine-tuning that allows life, came about by chance. This is something that I've only touched upon, but it is in itself a massive subject. An atheist also somehow has to overcome what I and many others consider to be the impossibility of spontaneous life and the real impossibility of complexity. The atheist has to disregard the fossil evidence, which in no way supports Darwin's theory, but instead points to various spontaneous explosions of diversity on the Earth. Alongside that, we have to disregard the very strong evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, which is backed up by countless miracles and changed lives. So much more could be said about that. There is also the miracle of fulfilled ancient prophecy that has to be overcome. If you're familiar with Occam's razor, consider what is the most likely explanation for all that we see if we fully open our eyes and put aside our presuppositions. And by the way, I haven't mentioned beauty, the beauty of every aspect of creation, beauty that so often has absolutely no selective advantage, but which is, I believe, a demonstration of the character of God. Is it by chance that every aspect of the universe, the stars, the clouds, mountains, forests, oceans, even the deserts, are majestic and beautiful? I've heard it said that God's fingerprints are all over creation and that he has put his footprint on history. Those footprints are really very deep. And talking of beauty, imagine watching the sun set with a loved one or companion. Consider experiencing the beauty of music or poetry and so much more. Can we seriously suggest that those experiences, the consciousness of those experiences, can really be explained as a series of biochemical reactions? We could easily have another massive section simply on the mystery of consciousness. Just before I end, let me quote one more scientist, Professor Paul Davies, Professor of Physics at Arizona State University. Professor Davies said these words: "Atheism, like Christianity, requires an act of faith. There is no evidence whatsoever for the non-existence of God, and there is plenty of evidence for his existence." So if you have any doubts, please do follow the links I'm giving you to talks and articles giving you much more information and evidence. And please get in touch. I really actually close now by repeating a line from John's Gospel. John, who claims to be an eyewitness of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus, wrote, "But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." It really is wonderful, truly wonderful, to know why we're here, and to actually know that God who made us is good, incredibly good, and kind, and he loves us. I hope you will come to the same conclusion as C.S. Lewis, that despite the mystery and uncertainty, the time has come for you to recognise that God is God and choose to follow his Son, Jesus. It really is what life is actually all about. It's what we're made for. It's what you and I were made for. Thank you.